And welcome back as we go ahead and jump right into looking at our next piece about arrays, which is that on multi-dimensional arrays. So to get us started, let's first entertain this idea of arrays with more than one index. Up to this point, when we create an array, it has always had one index. However, Java will actually allow us to create arrays with multiple indices. These are what are known as multi-dimensional arrays. So let's start off by looking at the array declarations for these multiple dimensional arrays. It's sometimes useful to have an array with more than one index, and this is allowed in Java. So the following would create an array of characters called page. The array page has two indices, the first index ranging from 0 to 29 and the second from 0 to 99. So char bracket bracket page equals new char 30 bracket 100. This is equivalent, of course, to the following two steps. Char bracket bracket page, and then page equals new char 30 bracket 100. It's the same thing as we've seen with multiple things with variables and class types and stuff like that. Now, we talked about we have multiple indices, so let's look at these index variables. The index variables for the array have two indices. So page 00, page 1532, page 299, etc., are three of the index variables for this array. You'll note that each index, of course, has to be enclosed with its own set of square brackets. As was true of one-dimensional arrays, as we've already seen, each index variable for a multi-dimensional array is a variable of the base type, and this type, the example, is char. Now, an array may have any number of indices, but perhaps the most common number is 2. Anytime we work with arrays, the most common ones are going to be either one single-dimensional array, or one dimension, or two-dimensional. A two-dimensional array can be visualized really kind of as a two-dimensional display, with the first index giving the row and the second index giving the column. So if we talk about the array index variables of a two-dimensional array called A and declared and created as a char, so let's say char A equals new char 512, we can kind of visualize it almost as follows. So A00, comma, and then A01, and then A02, so on and so forth, all the way down to A40, A41, so on and so forth. Now you might use the array A to store all the characters on a very, very small page of text that has, let's say, 5 lines, numbered 0 to 4, and 12 characters to each line. So let's kind of keep this in mind as we start thinking about, okay, so we can do this. How do we actually declare and create multidimensional arrays? Well, you declare a multidimensional array variable and create a multidimensional array object basically the same way that you would create and name a one-dimensional array. You simply just use as many square brackets as there are indices. So if we have a two-dimensional array, we have 2 square brackets, and therefore 2 sets of indices. If we have a three-dimensional array, as you can see here with int figure, that one is a three-dimensional array because we have 3 sets of square brackets, and therefore 3 sets of indices. Now, a multidimensional array is also an array of arrays. In Java, the way it works is that a two-dimensional array, such as the type A that we looked at, is an array of arrays. An array A is, on the previous slide, a one-dimensional array of size 5, whose base type is a one-dimensional array of characters of size 12. The array variable A contains a reference to a one-dimensional array of length 5, whose base type is of char array. That is, the base type of A is the type for the entire one-dimensional array of characters, and each index variable, A of 0, A of 1, and so forth, contains a reference to a one-dimensional array of characters. Now, as we've kind of seen a little bit already, arrays aren't just limited to 2 dimensions. A three-dimensional array, of course, is going to effectively be an array of arrays of arrays, and so on and so forth for higher dimensions. So if you had like 4, it'd be an array of arrays. Now, normally the fact that a two-dimensional array is an array of arrays need not concern you. We don't really have to worry about this idea of it. In fact, you could just usually act as if the array is just an array with 2 indices rather than an array of arrays, which is a little bit more hard to think of and also keep track of and different things. So just easier to think of we have 2 sets of indices to worry about. There are, of course, some situations where a two-dimensional array looks very much like an array of arrays, and we'll see this most often where we're using the instance variable length, as we have to think of a two-dimensional array as an array of arrays. And just real quick, I have a super quick demo here to show how to use a multi-dimensional array. You can see, of course, I've set up an integer type one, and I've set it to size 33. I'm going to fill this with user input, and you notice in this case, I'm using row and column as my names here. Now, I could, of course, use something like I and J. Those are perfectly also acceptable names, but I'm going to just stick to row and column for now. And so I'm going to go ahead and first fill that array, and then I'm going to print it. So let's just go ahead and give that a run. And for demonstration purposes, I'm going to keep it simple. I'm just going to do 1, 2, 3 over and over again. So 1, 2, 3. Oh, I did 12 there. That's okay. All right, and you notice the way it's formatted is that this is going to print out with each inner loop here coming out on a tab, and then there's just a blank print line statement to move us down when we move to the outer for loop. And that's a very important distinction here to keep in mind when we're looking at these multi-dimensional arrays, because anytime we're filling just, let's say, this inner index, so we of course have to, remember it's an array of arrays, so when we're filling that single array that's inside of that array, that is this inner for loop right here. So we're working on filling that up. When we move to the outer one, we're going to need another for loop here. And so that's the way to kind of think about when we start talking about filling arrays and we start talking about doing the different pieces here. If you're looking at for loop implementation, you're going to need to use more with more indices. Again, the most common thing you're probably going to run into will be two-dimensional arrays or one-dimensional arrays. And anytime we're working with two-dimensional arrays, just keep in mind that you're going to need a nested for loop to do a two-dimensional array. And this outer loop is what's going to control each row, as we can see here. So we have a row. It's a good way to visualize this. And each inner loop is going to control the columns here in that row. And so again, that's a great way to kind of help visualize this, to kind of wrap our mind around how a multi-dimensional array works. These are going to be very useful in some of the examples that we're going to look at to kind of analyze and pick apart why we might want to use a multi-dimensional array.